A More Perfect Union, on the genius and the burden of the American Constitution. I would like to begin not with the document itself, but with a room. Picture a sweltering hall in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The windows are nailed shut in the heat of a Pennsylvania July, because the men inside have agreed to secrecy, and they fear that a stray breeze carrying a stray voice might reach the street below. 55 men, most of them under 50, some of them barely more than boys, are gathered to repair a government that is failing. They believe they are meeting to revise a set of articles. They will end by abolishing them and writing in their place the oldest written national constitution still in force anywhere on the face of the earth. That is where I wish to begin tonight, with the astonishing improbability of the thing. We speak of the Constitution of the United States with such familiarity, such reflexive reverence or reflexive complaint, that we forget it might easily never have existed at all. It was not handed down from a mountain. It was argued into being line by contested line, by exhausted and quarreling men in a locked and stifling room, and it very nearly collapsed a dozen times before it was done. I want to spend our time together this evening considering three things: how this document came to be, what makes its architecture so quietly ingenious, and why, more than 2 centuries later, it remains both the great achievement and the great unfinished argument of American life. For the Constitution is not merely a legal instrument. It is, I will argue, a wager, a bet placed by one generation upon all the generations that would follow. The crisis that made it necessary. Let us first dispel a comfortable myth. The Constitution was not born of triumph. It was born of near failure. When the 13 colonies won their independence, they did not become a nation in any meaningful sense. They became 13 small republics, jealous of one another, bound together loosely by a document called the Articles of Confederation. And that first American government, let us be honest, did not work. It could not tax, it could only beg the states for money, and the states frequently declined. It could not regulate commerce, and so the states erected tariffs against one another, like quarrelsome neighbors building higher and higher fences. It had no chief executive to act, and no national court to judge. When farmers in Massachusetts, crushed by debt, rose up in what history calls Shays's Rebellion, the Confederation government could barely muster a response. The experiment in liberty was, only a few years in, drifting toward chaos. And so the wisest among the founders confronted a terrible and clarifying question, the question that sits at the very heart of the document we are discussing tonight. How do you build a government strong enough to govern, yet restrained enough never to become the tyranny you just fought a war to escape? Hold that question in your mind, because everything that follows is an answer to it. Every clause, every check, every deliberate frustration built into the machinery of American government flows from that single, agonizing tension: power sufficient to act, power insufficient to oppress. The great compromises. The men in that Philadelphia room did not agree. I want to emphasize this because we are sometimes taught to imagine the founders as a single serene mind, a chorus of demigods speaking in unison. They were nothing of the kind. They were rivals. They represented large states and small states, commercial states and agrarian states, and, we must never look away from this, states built upon slavery and states beginning to turn against it. The first great rupture was over representation. The large states, led by Virginia, proposed a legislature apportioned by population. The more people, the more power. The small states recoiled in terror at being swallowed whole, and countered that each state should have an equal voice, as under the old Confederation. For weeks the convention deadlocked, and more than once men threatened to walk out and let the whole enterprise die. What saved it was compromise, the unglamorous, essential art of the half-loaf. They built a legislature of 2 chambers, a House of Representatives apportioned by population to satisfy the large states, and a Senate in which every state, large or small, would have 2 votes to protect the small. We call it the Great Compromise, and it is worth pausing to admire, because it embodies a truth the founders understood in their bones, that a durable government is not one in which someone wins totally, but one in which no one loses totally. But I would be committing an act of intellectual cowardice if I described the compromises of 1787 and stopped there, in the warm light of mutual concession. For there was another compromise, and it was monstrous. To hold the Union together, the framers struck a bargain with slavery. They agreed that an enslaved human being, a person owned, bought, and sold, would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation, swelling the power of the slaveholding states while granting the enslaved nothing at all. They agreed to protect the slave trade for 20 years. They wrote clauses to return those who escaped bondage. The document did not use the word slavery. The framers were careful to keep the ugly word off the page, as if its absence might soften the reality. But the institution was woven into the structure, and it would take a civil war that killed some 600,000 Americans and 3 constitutional amendments written in the aftermath to begin cutting it out. I raise this not to condemn the founders from the comfortable distance of the present, but because we cannot honestly praise the genius of the Constitution without also acknowledging the wound written into its origins. It was, from the first, both a charter of liberty and a compromise with bondage. Both things are true. A mature people can hold both truths at once. The architecture of restraint. Let us now turn to the machinery itself, for here lies the quiet genius that has allowed this document to endure. The founders had read their history, and they had read their philosophy, Montesquieu above all, and they had arrived at a conviction that we might call a theory of human nature. They did not trust power in any single pair of hands. They did not, in fact, wholly trust anyone. If men were angels, James Madison wrote, no government would be necessary. But men are not angels, and so the founders designed a government on the assumption that the people running it would sooner or later be ambitious, self-interested, and tempted toward tyranny. Their solution was as elegant as it was pessimistic. They divided power, and then they set the divided pieces against one another. First, they separated the government into 3 branches, a legislature to make the laws, an executive to carry them out, and a judiciary to interpret them. But separation alone was not enough, for a branch left entirely to itself might still grow monstrous. So they did something subtler. They gave each branch a set of weapons pointed at the others. The president may veto the acts of Congress, but Congress may override that veto and may impeach and remove the president. The courts may strike down the acts of both, but the president appoints the judges and the Senate must confirm them. Ambition, Madison wrote in the 51st Federalist, in words every citizen ought to know, must be made to counteract ambition. The security against tyranny would not depend on the virtue of officials. It would depend on their rivalry. Each guardian would be watched by another guardian, jealous of his own power. We call this system checks and balances, and it is, I submit to you, the central mechanical innovation of the American Constitution, a perpetual motion machine of mutual suspicion, designed so that no faction, no branch, no single charismatic figure could ever gather all the reins into one hand. And then atop this horizontal division among branches, they laid a vertical one, federalism, the division of power between the national government and the states. Certain powers were granted to the center, the rest were reserved to the states and to the people. 2 governments, layered one upon another, each a check upon the other. The result, and I want you to see this clearly because it is so easily mistaken for a flaw, the result is a government that is deliberately inefficient. It is hard to pass a law. It is meant to be hard. The founders did not prize speed, they feared it, for they knew that the swiftest governments are the ones most easily captured by a passion, a mob, or a tyrant. They built friction into the very engine of the state. When you feel frustrated at the slowness of American government, and you will, I ask you to remember that the slowness is not a malfunction. It is the design working exactly as intended, the living document and the dead hand. Here we arrive at the deepest and most contested question the Constitution poses to us, and it is a question of philosophy as much as of law. The document you can read tonight is, in its core text, largely the document of 1787, amended but recognizably the same. And this raises a genuine puzzle, one that Thomas Jefferson himself wrestled with. By what right, Jefferson asked, does one generation bind the next? Why should Americans living today be governed by rules written by men who have been dead for 2 centuries, men who could not imagine the telephone, let alone the internet, who legislated for a nation of 4 million souls clinging to the Atlantic coast, and whose words now govern a continental republic of hundreds of millions? Jefferson worried about what he called the dead hand of the past, its cold grip closing around the throat of the living. The framers, to their enduring credit, anticipated this. They knew they were not wise enough to legislate for all time, and so they built into the document a mechanism for its own revision, the amendment process, laid out in Article 5. But they made it hard, deliberately, characteristically hard. An amendment requires supermajorities to propose and the assent of 3/4 of the states to ratify. In more than 2 centuries, out of many thousands of attempts, the Constitution has been amended only 27 times, and the first 10 of those, the Bill of Rights, that magnificent enumeration of freedoms of speech, of religion, of the press, of the accused, came almost at once as the price of ratification. And so a tension was built into the American constitutional order that has never been resolved, and I would argue cannot be resolved, only managed. Is the Constitution a fixed text, to be read as its authors understood it, a contract whose terms do not shift with fashion? Or is it a living framework whose grand phrases, due process, equal protection, cruel and unusual, were written broadly on purpose, to be interpreted anew by each generation in the light of its own understanding? This is not an abstract quarrel for law professors. It is the fault line running through the most consequential arguments in American life. When the Supreme Court decides what the Constitution permits and forbids, it is choosing, consciously or not, where to stand on this very question. And reasonable, learned, patriotic people stand on opposite sides of it. I will not tell you tonight which side is right, because I do not believe it is the office of a lecturer to install his own conclusions in the minds of his audience. But I will insist that you understand the question, for it is one of the great intellectual dramas of self-government. How a people remains faithful to its founding principles, while refusing to be imprisoned by its founders' limitations. The wager. Let me now draw toward my conclusion, and return to the word I offered at the beginning, a wager. The Constitution begins with 3 words rendered in a hand larger than all the rest. We the people. We have heard them so often that they have gone smooth like a stone worn by the sea, but I ask you to hear them freshly. In an age of kings, when nearly every government on earth traced its authority to God, or to conquest, or to the accident of bloodline, this document located its authority in an astonishing and radical place in the people themselves, not in a monarch, not in an army, not in a church, in the consent of the governed. That was the wager. The founders bet, against most of human history, against the counsel of the cynics of every age, that ordinary people could govern themselves, that a nation could be held together not by a crown or a sword, but by an argument written on parchment, and by the willingness of each generation to keep faith with it. It was a bet placed under conditions of profound uncertainty. Many of the framers themselves doubted it would last. Benjamin Franklin, asked as he left that Philadelphia Hall what kind of government they had produced, is said to have answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." If you can keep it. Notice the condition. Notice the burden he placed not upon the document, but upon everyone who would come after. The Constitution does not keep itself. Parchment has no power of its own. It cannot enforce a single one of its own commands. It endures only so long as the living choose in each generation to honor it, to accept the outcome of an election they lost, to respect a court that ruled against them, to argue fiercely and yet remain within the rules of the argument. The document is only as strong as the habits and the character of the people who inherit it. And that, in the end, is why I find it worthy not merely of study, but of a certain awe. Not because it is perfect. We have seen tonight that it was flawed gravely from its birth. Not because its authors were saints. They were brilliant, quarreling, self-interested and complicit men. But because they managed, in a locked room in a hot summer, to write down a way for a free people to govern themselves and to argue with one another without resorting to the sword, and because that framework, amended and stretched and fought over, has held for longer than any of them dared to hope. The Constitution is an unfinished sentence. Each generation is handed the pen. The founders wrote the first clause, the abolitionists and the soldiers of the Civil War wrote the next, the suffragists, the marchers, the reformers of every era have added their own, and the pen is passed now to you. So I leave you with Franklin's condition, which is really a question, and which every generation must answer afresh. They gave us a republic. The only question that has ever mattered, the question the parchment cannot answer but only we can, is whether we can keep it.